again, everyone. Welcome back. I have missed you guys. I hope you all had a great Easter. It was also my birthday, and I got so sick, lost my voice. Still not 100%, so I'm gonna see how much I can get through. I think I'm close to 100%, but not quite. All right, so we're on chapter 4 now, and it's called The Holes in Helter, Skelter. So if you remember, Helter, Skelter is the book that was written by the prosecuting attorney Vince Bugliosi, and it's supposedly the official narrative of what happened, but as we keep going, you will find out that no, there were some major problems with it that nobody seemed to question for the last, I don't know how many years. So let's dive in. The first little piece is called Moorehouse Moves In. As my trust in Bugliosi faltered, I kept revisiting Helter Skelter, turning its pages in search of some detail that felt forced or wrong, especially where Terry Melcher was concerned. One day, a few sentences jumped out at me. After Terry Melcher had moved out of the Cielo Drive residence, but before the Polanskis had moved in, Greg Jacobson had arranged for a Dean Moorehouse to stay there for a brief period. During this time, Tex Watson had visited Moorehouse at least 3 and possibly as many as 6 times. Now, I don't know if you know much about the whole Manson story, but one of the girls, one of Charlie's girls, was Ruth Ann Moorehouse, and she was 15. So this Dean Moorehouse is actually her dad. So it adds a little bit more of a link there to this property. Something about that offhand phrasing, a Dean Moorehouse, raised a red flag for me. This was the only time Moorehouse was mentioned in the book. He had been a peripheral member of the family, a wavering Protestant minister, insurance salesman, and married father of 3. He was living in San Jose when he first encountered Manson in 1967. How does a married father of 3 just go off with some band of hippies? I don't understand that. He was living in San Jose when he first encountered Manson in 1967, when the ex-con was fresh out of federal prison and hitchhiking. Moorehouse pulled over to give him a lift, which turned into an invitation to dinner, which blossomed into a friendship of sorts. Moorehouse, who strayed from his ministry and was himself on probation for a forgery charge, was searching for something new and was eager to discuss spirituality. Manson was eager to ogle Moorehouse's 15-year-old daughter, Ruth Ann. Before long, Manson absconded with Ruth Ann on a trip up the California coast, prompting her mother to report her to the police as a runaway. Did she report her husband as a runaway as well? Dean Moorehouse had left the marriage by then. He'd fallen under the spell of the 60s and grown a long white beard. By March 1968, he was in trouble with the law again, facing an arrest for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Police had found him when they raided a home in search of marijuana. Soon afterward, he was arrested again, this time for selling LSD. The legend is that Manson persuaded him to try it for the first time, after which he renounced his earthly possessions. Well, he got a lot of people to do stuff under the influence of LSD, I believe. Moorehouse kept chasing his daughter, who'd remain with the family. Manson had rechristened her Oish. Now, I looked up how do you pronounce this. I'll put the spelling here. I've seen it Wish, and I've seen it Wish, and I've seen it Oish. It seems like Oish to me, but I don't know. You guys tell me what you think. When Moorehouse followed them to Dennis Wilson's house in the Pacific Palisades, Manson kneeled and kissed his feet, launching a charm offensive that effectively ended the conflict. Now, he kissed a couple people's feet. That's so weird. Increasingly sympathetic to the family's philosophies, Moorehouse moved into the back cabin and lived there rent-free in exchange for maintaining the landscaping. Manson had converted a one-time Christian minister. That tells you how powerful and charming he seemed to be, right? It seems like a tough thing to do. But when had Moorehouse taken up residence in the Cielo home? Melcher had told me he had no memory of it. Bugliosi wrote that it was after Melcher moved out, meaning in January 1969. I found Moorehouse in the phone book and gave him a call. He was friendly, though spacey. Now 79, he was living in Northern California under the name Baba, which Manson had given him, so he was still under that spell. He had more than 400 LSD trips between 1967 and 1972. Are people keeping track of how many LSD trips they go on? That seems odd to me. When I talk to you, I'm talking to myself, he explained. When you talk to me, you're talking to yourself. That stuff really does fry your brain. In the trial, they said, no, there's no long-term effects of it, but I have my suspicions that that's not true. Be that as it may, he had a sharp recall for his time with Manson, and what he told me didn't vindicate Melcher or Bugliosi in the slightest. It was impossible that he'd moved into the Cielo house in January 1969, for one simple reason. He'd gone to prison then. Moorehouse had been arrested on a drug charge in Ukiah, California. In the midst of his time with the family, he had to head back north for his trial. They convicted me in December of '68, he said. I was due back there at the end of December for sentencing, and then on January 3rd, they hauled me off to Vacaville, a correctional facility. Moorehouse said he'd really lived at Cielo off and on through the summer of '68 when Melcher lived there. So he lived there at the same time. That's even stronger of a link. Terry was a good friend, he explained, and when I first met him at Dennis's, he said, if it's okay with you, I'll send my chauffeur down one of these days and have you come up to my house. Melcher took me in and showed me a bedroom and said, this is your bedroom. You can stay here anytime that you want. So I was staying there off and on whenever I felt like it. He also confirmed a detail from Ed Sanders, The Family, so a book called The Family, that Melcher had let him borrow his Jaguar for the long drive to Ukiah. I drove the Jaguar up there with Tex Watson, he said. Melcher gave it to me to use on this trip, and he gave me his credit card to use for gas and anything that happened to the car. Now, Melcher claimed that I know that Moorehouse is not, he is linked to Manson, but Melcher claimed he only met Manson 3 times. But who is just handing over the keys to their Jaguar and their credit card to somebody that they're just acquaintances of? I don't think so. I asked Moorehouse for written proof of his time in prison. With his permission, I got a copy of his parole record from the state of California. It showed that he entered the prison system on January 2nd, 1969. So he was telling the truth, more or less. He got the date a little bit wrong. So Bugliosi's timeline was wrong, and Melcher had lied to me. I felt I had to talk to Melcher about this, though I knew it would anger him. He might cut me off afterward. Still, I called him up and laid out the evidence as gingerly as I could. Melcher wasn't having it. He stuck to the story as Bugliosi had told it in Helter, Skelter, and promptly got rid of me. Not long after, I got a disturbing call from Rudy Altobelli, sounding more upset and angry than I'd ever heard him. He'd been in touch with Melcher for the first time in many years. Their conversations had left him feeling out of the loop. In Altobelli's eyes, the golden penetrators, gross, Jacobson, Wilson, Melcher, had always known that Manson had spent time up at the house, but they were too scared to say it on the stand. Now, were they scared that they would be implicated somehow, or were they just scared of what Manson and the family might do to them? I don't know, it's hard to say. That task fell to Altobelli, who now felt he'd been pressured into talking about it under oath without understanding the full story. Once they'd started talking again, Altobelli asked Melcher about Dean Moorehouse, with my reporting in mind. Melcher had snapped, saying he was going to call Bugliosi. Vince was supposed to take care of all that, he said, and now it's all resurfacing. Okay, so what is there to take care of? If you're telling the truth, there's nothing to take care of, right? So the plot thickens. Okay, the next section is called Melcher's Lies. Stephen Kay of the Los Angeles DA's office told me to call another longtime employee there, Sandy Gibbons. She might be sympathetic to my aims. Before she worked for the DA, Gibbons had been a journalist, and her coverage of the Manson trial left her deeply skeptical of Bugliosi and his motives. She became one of several reporters who believed that Bugliosi was corrupt, arrogant, vain, even crazy. Later, when he pursued elected office, she wrote a number of stories detailing his misconduct as a prosecutor. I took Gibbons out to lunch and found her impressively forthright, soft-spoken and direct. She was certain that Bugliosi had covered up for Terry Melcher during the trial. The two must have made some kind of deal. You testify to this, and I'll keep you out of that. She also confirmed that Bugliosi had stolen a bunch of the DA's files for his book, knowing full well that it was illegal to remove them. It bothered her that he was always portrayed as upstanding and above board. He was a snake. She could still recall the sight of a vein throbbing in his temple. If I ever saw that vein, she warned me, it meant that Bugliosi was about to blow his stack. Once I'd earned her trust, she agreed to show me the DA's Manson file. I could make photocopies of anything I wanted, though she would have to supervise me as I went through everything. She was under no obligation to show me any of these documents, and though she never said it, I was under the impression that my visits weren't exactly authorized. Gibbons led me through the labyrinth of the DA's office and unlocked a storage room. Long, narrow, and windowless, the room accommodated a row of cabinets with barely enough space for the 2 chairs that Gibbons and I carried in. I leafed through endless folders containing police reports, interview notes, investigation summaries, chronologies, photographs, rap sheets, mugshots, suspect lists, and best of all, a half dozen or more faded legal pads of Bugliosi's interviews with his most prized witnesses. I made notes and set aside any documents I wanted to copy. Gibbons had to clear them, but she approved everything at a glance. Several times she called my attention to folders that had nothing in them, telling me that Bugliosi or Bill Nelson had removed their contents. That cannot be legal. It can't be. I spent hours in that room, returning 4 times in the next few weeks and several more times in the ensuing years. On my 3rd visit, I'd struck gold, a long yellow legal pad with pages of notes scrawled in black ink. Much of it crossed through, but still legible. It was an interview of one of Bugliosi's key witnesses, Danny DiCarlo, who testified for 8 consecutive days, often under blistering cross-examination. A biker from Venice in a gang called the Straight Satans, DiCarlo began staying at the Spawn Ranch in the spring of 1969, so not too far before all the incidents happened. He and his associates provided a degree of security that endeared him to Manson, who'd grown paranoid and embattled. DiCarlo's father was in the firearms business, and although Danny was never a full-fledged member of the family, he soon ran their arsenal, a cache of weapons that grew to include a submachine gun. Where do you get such a thing? In exchange, he and the other bikers got access to drugs and the family's girls. His testimony did a lot of heavy lifting for Bugliosi. He detailed Manson's plan to ignite the Helter-Skelter race war. He outlined the ways Manson dominated his followers, and he identified the weapons used in the murders. In the crossed-out sections of Bugliosi's notes, to my astonishment, DiCarlo described 3 visits by Terry Melcher to the Manson family after the murders. He said there were 3 visits total, and I don't believe any of them were after the murders, but here's at least an additional 3 after the murders. I read them, reread them, and reread them again. I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. I took scrupulous word-for-word notes in case Gibbons looked too closely at the flag pages and realized that they completely upended one of the most important cases in her office's history. Luckily, she let me photocopy them without a second glance. At home, I looked again. I hadn't imagined it. In an interview on February 11th, 1970, DiCarlo described Melcher's 2 visits to the Spawn Ranch in late August and early September 1969, and his 3rd visit to the Barker Ranch, more than 200 miles away, in mid-September. Okay, so the murders happened in August, and he's traveling 200 miles to meet up with them in September. According to Bugliosi's notes, DiCarlo didn't approach Melcher on any of these occasions, so he didn't know what Melcher and Manson discussed, but he was certain each time that it was Melcher he saw. Bugliosi's notes on the 2 visits to the Spawn Ranch read, DiCarlo released 72 hours after the bust on 8/16/69. went back to Venice for a few days, and then went back to Spahn Ranch. Week and a half later, went up to Barker with Tex and Bruce Davis in a flatbed truck. Manson and 4 or 5 girls left at the same time in a car. Rest of family stayed at Spahn. Between time that Danny returned to the ranch and time he left for Barker, definitely saw Melcher out at Spahn Ranch. Heard girls say, "Terry's coming, Terry's coming." Melcher drove up in a metro truck by himself. Melcher stayed for 3 or 4 hours. 3 or 4 days later, saw Melcher in this same truck. So that's twice at Spahn. Then he writes on the 3rd visit, which occurred in the canyon passageway to the family's hideouts in Death Valley. Weeks later, saw Melcher with Gypsy and Brenda at the bottom of Golar Wash near Ballarat, sitting in the car with the girls. DiCarlo was with Sadie, Tex, Manson, Bruce, and Dennis on foot. All of them got in Melcher's car, everyone in the car. Brenda had been the driver, Melcher only a passenger. Everyone called Melcher Terry. Charlie took over the driver's seat and drove to Ridgecrest and picked up a 1959 Buick. DiCarlo and the rest drove off, leaving Melcher, Manson, and Brenda in the car they had. That's the last time the witness saw Melcher. Sorry guys, my voice is going. I cross-referenced this with the trial transcripts, which I'd photocopied at the California Court of Appeals. Pulling Melcher's testimony from my filing cabinet, I saw that the grand jury hearing in December 1969, Bugliosi had asked him whether he ever saw Manson after his May 1969 visit to the Spahn Ranch. "No, I didn't," Melcher replied under oath. Does anyone take under oath seriously? I would think so, but it doesn't seem like it. During the trial, Bugliosi asked him again, "After this second occasion that you went to the Spahn Ranch, which is a couple of days later, after May 18th, 1969, did you ever see Mr. Manson thereafter?" "No," Melcher said, again under oath. Next, he was cross-examined by the defense's Paul Fitzgerald. "Do you recall the last time you saw Charles Manson?" "Yeah, just a few days after May 18th, at the ranch." 3 different times on the stand, always as a witness for Bugliosi, Melcher lied about not seeing Manson after May 1969. Next, I pulled out Danny DiCarlo's testimony to see if Bugliosi had ever asked him about Melcher. It never happened. Now, I wonder how often lawyers do this, though. Do they leave out certain things, hoping that the defense won't figure it out? I don't know. I mean, how can you just craft everything if there's discovery? And I mean, unless you're cheating that system too. I guess it probably happens. This was a stunner, never before revealed. Without DiCarlo's testimony, Bugliosi said he might never have gotten his convictions. Only Linda Kasabian, the member of the family who testified in exchange for immunity, spent more time on the stand. Clearly, this was information Bugliosi didn't want before the jury. But why? Was it simply because any post-murder visits by Melcher undermined the Helter Skelter motive? Bugliosi argued that Manson chose the Cielo house to instill fear in Melcher, as Susan Atkins said. But if Melcher were with Manson after the murders, where was the fear? And most important, what were these additional meetings about? Maybe Melcher knew that the family was behind the murders, but for some reason believed he was safe. Was this the secret Bugliosi was hiding? And if so, to whose benefit? As I read the DA's file more carefully, I found that every single thing DiCarlo and Bugliosi had discussed that day was later repeated by DiCarlo on the witness stand, except the description of Melcher's visit after the murders. In his notes, Bugliosi had crossed out all of these references. The defense should have received a copy of the DiCarlo interview. So Bugliosi was legally required to turn over all his evidence to the other side. But I'm wondering if maybe he had a second set of notebooks, like if this is his, rough copy that has stuff scratched out, maybe he made a second copy to hand over for discovery. I don't know. It's possible, right? As soon as I could, I scheduled a lunch with the defense's Paul Fitzgerald to see if he knew anything about this. We met at his favorite restaurant downtown near the courthouse. Fitzgerald, an ex-boxer who was legendary in LA legal circles, was his usual animated self, loud, vulgar, slapping the table to make his points, already into his second martini before the first course arrived. Wasting no time, I showed him the documents I'd copied at the DA's, trying not to sway his reaction. His mouth dropped open. "This is Vince Bugliosi's handwriting," he said. "I never saw this before." So they didn't get a copy of it. Obviously, they didn't want to put on this evidence. Fitzgerald and the defense team had paid a lot of attention to DiCarlo, thinking he might be an asset to them. He was not a member of the family, had a good relationship with Truth, lived at the ranch, was an outsider, pretty straightforward guy in most ways. Incredible. I liked him. He didn't embellish anything, told it the way it was. That made this document all the more legitimate, in Fitzgerald's eyes, and more sensational. I'm very shocked. He argued that Bugliosi, who was extremely deceitful, and the robot he claimed his defendants were, had written a script for the entire trial, getting witnesses to agree to his narrative in advance. I mean, that's a huge accusation, right? Imagine, it's too late now, but what if this had come out way earlier and turned over the verdict? That's a huge deal. Assuming that they would return to their ways. I was relieved by Fitzgerald's astonishment. It convinced me that I wasn't overreacting here. Wanting to eliminate any possible doubt, I tried for months to find Danny DiCarlo himself, but he seemed to have vanished. I did eventually track down a girlfriend of his who told me that she got my interview request to him. He lived mainly in Mexico these days, she said. I never heard back from him. He probably moved away to wash his hands of this whole period of his life. I felt it was becoming nearly impossible to deny that Bugliosi had manipulated some of his witnesses, or that he'd conspired with at least two of his principals to conceal the facts of the case and shore up his motive. If Melcher and DiCarlo were tainted, and if Melcher had committed outright perjury, suborned by Bugliosi, then the veracity of the prosecutor's entire case, including the extraordinary hippie race war motive that made him a best-selling author, was called into question. Yeah, that's a huge deal. The implications are huge. The next section's called "The Guy is Psychotic." As one of the biggest bands in the world, the Beach Boys employed a retinue of managers, roadies, engineers, and gophers. I wondered if any of them had any thoughts on Wilson and Melcher, or if they could fill in some blanks for me. The band's surviving members had all declined to speak to me. I got in touch with John Parks, who'd been the band's tour manager when Manson and the family lived at Wilson's place. He recalled that Melcher had not only met Manson, but recorded him too. What? Terry recorded him while we were on a fairly long tour, Parks told me. That was something else Melcher had expressly denied on the stand, something hidden for all these decades. Bugliosi repeated it in his closing statement. He did not record Manson. When Melcher moved to end his professional relationship with Manson, things took a dark turn. As Parks remembered it, Manson began calling Melcher and unloading on him, making death threats against him to everybody he saw. He was yelling about it and stuff. Parks could certainly understand, he said, how those threats could have influenced Melcher's decision to move out of the Cielo house so suddenly. What? I thought it was his maid who was hard to deal with. After the murders, I asked, did Parks or any of his colleagues suspect Manson? Of course, he said, I knew that Terry had kind of fired Charlie and stopped recording him. So my first thought was that Charlie had made a mistake and actually got Sharon Tate instead of Terry. I'm not sure how you could confuse those two. One of Manson's girls, he explained, had already told him that the family had murdered one of the caretakers at the Spawn Ranch, Donald Shorty Shea, whose body wasn't found until 1977. You could look at all these folks and see that they were totally drugged out, Parks said. After one of the girls told me that they killed the caretaker, then it got real serious for me. Everyone in their scene suspected Manson right away, he said, even though it took the LAPD nearly 4 months to bring him to justice. I have no idea why they didn't arrest him right away, because to me it was pretty obvious. The Hollywood community knew that the Beach Boys had been wrapped up in Manson's world, and it turned them into pariahs for a time. Nightclubs where they'd once been welcomed were suddenly turning them away. We couldn't go out because people didn't want us at their place, Parks said. So yeah, if that's the case, then they must have had a pretty established relationship. So you're saying a huge community of people knew before the world did that Charles Manson committed these murders? Yeah. Parks went on to say something even more dizzying. He was positive that the FBI had sent agents to the Beach Boys' office soon after the murders. They were monitoring our phones because they thought there was some connection with those guys, he said. They were sitting in my office, picking up my telephone. I'm sure they had the phones tapped, but they weren't sharing information with us. He told the FBI about Manson early on, but they didn't seem to act on his tip. I didn't know why they weren't doing anything, and everybody else was just trying to stay out of the situation. For the Beach Boys, we didn't want that kind of publicity, and neither did anybody else. Steve Despard, the Beach Boys recording engineer, remembered the ordeal that Manson had put him through during the recording sessions, when he'd show up with about 12 girls, many underage, quiet, in a stupor. The group smelled so foul that the studio's management, at the behest of Brian Wilson's wife, soon installed a sanitary bathroom seat. She didn't want to sit on the toilet after them. I can't say that I blame her. In the control room, Manson, reeking, would pull out a knife and clean his fingernails, wave it around and gesture. That's so gross. After 3 sessions, Despard was fed up. He called the Beach Boys manager and said, I refuse to be alone with him. The guy is psychotic and scares the hell out of me. Despard emphasized he was after Melcher. Melcher was not out of the picture at this point. He was part of the project. When I was recording Charles Manson, it was for Dennis and Terry Melcher. For a layperson. Melcher would never admit that, and I didn't want to talk to him again until I'd done my due diligence. Fortunately, in the archives of the LA County Sheriff's Office, I soon stumbled on further proof that Melcher had visited Manson after the murders. LASO had records of an interview with Paul Watkins, another key member of the family, who testified against Manson. He too saw Melcher at the Spawn Ranch around the same time as Danny DiCarlo had, the first week of September 1969. What he told the unnamed interviewer was shocking to me. Melcher was on acid, was on his knees, asked Manson to forgive him. Terry Melcher failed to keep an appointment, called him a pig. They're all little piggies. Helter Skelter meant for everyone to die. That's interesting. That's a very far cry from I just met the guy 3 times. Charlie gave Greg Jacobson a .45 slug and said, give Dennis Wilson this and tell him I have another one for him. This was even more explosive than the files from the DA, I realized. Not only did it suggest that Melcher had some bizarre debt to Manson, it opened up Watkins to accusations of perjury. Just like DiCarlo, Watkins had omitted these details from his testimony. He made no mention of having seen Melcher at the Spawn Ranch in early September 1969, much less having seen him on acid, begging for forgiveness. As much as the Watkins interview buttressed my case for a cover-up, it brought a host of new questions. Why did Melcher need Manson's forgiveness? Did he know that it was he who was supposed to die that night? Had Manson instilled much more fear in him than anyone had ever known? And what had compelled Bugliosi to believe that he could hide the true extent of their relationship? I wondered how many other stories like this had been kept secret. Now I felt I had a stronger shot at grabbing Melcher's attention, maybe even at getting him to concede that he lied. Good luck with that. I doubt it. First, though, I had to contend with Bugliosi. As the summer faded into autumn in the first year of my reporting, I had a hunch that Vince was keeping close tabs on me, even monitoring my progress in a way. Altobelli had suggested that Vince was always asking about me, trying to undermine my credibility. He thought I was only masquerading as a magazine journalist. Sounds like he's getting a little paranoid. I guess, though, if you have a lot of lies to hide, you probably would be paranoid too, especially such explosive lies. When I heard about Melcher's puzzling remark, Vince was supposed to take care of all that, I made a conscious decision to distance myself from Bugliosi. Although we'd once spoken on an almost weekly basis, I hadn't been in touch with him since June. One day in October, I came home to find that he'd left a message on my machine. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, sounding unusually serious. This was it, I thought. I set up my tape recorder and called him back. "How you doing, buddy?" he answered, sounding manic. "Listen, are you still working on this thing?" Then he added, "Someone, I don't remember who, called me. If there's something about my handling of the case, anything at all, that you had a question about, I would appreciate if you would call me to get my view on it. I think I did a fairly good job, and I can't think of things that I would do differently. But for a lay person, they may look at it and say he should not have done this. This is improper, or what have you, and I'd like to at least be heard." Oh, so he's getting real nervous. Why would you get so nervous if you had done everything above board? You probably wouldn't, right? I told him I would absolutely give him a chance to be heard, and that I did, in fact, have some questions, but I didn't have them ready yet. "Okay," he said, "yeah, call me, because there may be a justification or reason why I did something that as a lay person you would not know. You're too stupid to understand lawyers." That's the gist I'm getting. Now I was positive that he had some notion of what I'd been researching, whom I'd been talking to. I mentioned that I'd made halting progress on the piece, which was still expected for premiere, even if it was running behind schedule. The Melcher angle, I said, wondering if he'd take the bait, had been so impossible to get. "Were you ever able to get in touch with Terry?" he asked. I said I was. "Oh, you've talked to him? You got him on the phone?" Vince's surprise was evident, but I couldn't tell if it was feigned or not. I felt like he was hoping to get me talking, to feel out my progress. I got off the phone as soon as I could. I didn't hear from him again until December, just a few days before Christmas, when he left a phone message asking for my address. He probably wanted to send him a Christmas card, right? He said he wanted to send me a CD of some songs by Manson that a guy playing Manson in a movie had given him. When I didn't return the call, he left another message the next day to make sure I understood that the music was very rare and not otherwise available. I didn't return that call either, but the same night I got a call from Altabelli, who said that Vince had called him twice that day. He's getting real nervous, huh? "Wanting to know what you're doing." Their second conversation ended in a shouting match, Altabelli said, after he started asking Bugliosi about some of the information I'd shared over the previous months. That was enough for me. I wouldn't speak to Vince again for 7 years. So, what do you guys think? It's getting a little juicier, right? It's another couple of chapters before we start getting into the CIA stuff, which is really the main push of the book. We're still kind of in the background phase, but it's all interesting. I hope you guys are finding it to be as well. Hope you can hear me. My voice, I know my voice is soft on a good day, but I completely lost my voice on Easter and the following 2 days. So this is the best it's been. All right, you guys, I hope you all are enjoying this. Put any questions you have or thoughts down in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next one for the second half of chapter 4. And this book really isn't that long. It's only 12 chapters, so we're about close to a third of the way through. But the end is where it gets really interesting. So I hope you guys will stick around, and thanks for putting up with my voice today. Take care of yourselves. All right, bye.